The scorching sun had turned Marcus Chen's lips into cracked leather, and his water bottle had been empty for 18 hours. As he stumbled through the endless Arizona desert, each step felt like walking on broken glass. The GPS in his hiking pack had died 2 days ago, his cell phone showed no signal, and the trail he'd been following had vanished into rocky terrain that all looked the same. What Marcus didn't know was that death wasn't the only thing hunting him in this vast wilderness. Two figures had been tracking his desperate path for hours, massive men whose ancestors had survived in this harsh land for centuries, and who possessed skills that would either save his life or witness his final moments. This is the true story of how a software engineer from Seattle learned that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and that the difference between life and death can depend on strangers who owe you nothing but choose to risk everything. Marcus Chen had always been the type of person who planned everything down to the smallest detail. His co-workers at the tech company in Seattle often joked that he could schedule a spontaneous moment if he really tried. So when his girlfriend Sarah broke up with him after 3 years together, citing his need to control every aspect of their relationship, Marcus felt his carefully constructed world crumble like a house of cards in an earthquake. The breakup happened on a rainy Tuesday evening in March. Sarah had packed her bags before he got home from work, leaving only a note on the kitchen counter next to his neatly organized vitamin supplements. She wrote that she felt suffocated by his constant planning, his need to research every restaurant before they went out, his habit of making spreadsheets for their vacation itineraries. She said she needed adventure, spontaneity, someone who could live in the moment instead of always preparing for the next one. For 3 weeks, Marcus threw himself into his work, debugging code and attending meetings like a man possessed. His supervisor, Janet, finally pulled him aside and suggested he take some time off. She'd noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the way he'd been snapping at junior developers, the empty energy drink cans piling up around his desk like aluminum monuments to his insomnia. That night, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, staring at the wall where Sarah's paintings used to hang. The white spaces looked like wounds. He opened his laptop and, in a moment of uncharacteristic impulsiveness, booked a solo hiking trip to Arizona. He'd never been hiking before, but something about the idea of walking alone through empty wilderness appealed to him. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe he needed to do something unpredictable for once in his life. He spent the next 2 weeks researching hiking trails with the same intensity he brought to software projects. He bought expensive gear from REI, read hiking forums late into the night, and studied topographic maps until his eyes burned. He chose the Superstition Wilderness, a rugged area east of Phoenix known for its challenging terrain and the legend of the Lost Dutchman's gold mine. The name itself seemed to promise the kind of adventure Sarah said was missing from their relationship. Marcus flew into Phoenix on a Thursday morning in early April. The desert heat hit him like opening an oven door, even though it was still early spring. He rented a Jeep and drove east toward Apache Junction, watching the city give way to endless stretches of saguaro cacti and red rock formations that looked like sleeping giants. The landscape was so different from the green forests and gray skies of Seattle that it might as well have been another planet. He checked into a modest motel near the trailhead and spent the evening organizing his gear. His backpack contained enough supplies for what he'd planned as a 3-day hike: water purification tablets, energy bars, a first aid kit, sleeping bag, tent, and a GPS device that had cost him $400. He'd downloaded detailed maps of the area and marked waypoints along his chosen route. Even in his attempt at spontaneity, Marcus couldn't help but plan. The next morning, he woke before sunrise and loaded his pack. The weight surprised him. He'd practiced hiking around Seattle with the loaded pack, but somehow it felt heavier now that he was actually setting out into unknown territory. He drove to the Peralta trailhead as the sky began to lighten, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold that no photograph could capture. Only 2 other cars sat in the small parking area. Marcus checked his gear one more time, left a note on his dashboard with his intended route and return date, and set off toward the mountains as the sun cleared the horizon. The trail started easy enough, a well-marked path that wound through desert scrubland dotted with prickly pear cacti and acotio plants. The morning air was cool and pleasant, and Marcus began to feel something he hadn't experienced in months: a sense of peace. For the first few hours, everything went according to plan. He stopped frequently to drink water and take pictures with his phone, documenting the strange beauty of the desert landscape. He saw his first roadrunner dart across the trail and later spotted a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of his boots on the rocky path and the occasional rustle of small animals in the brush. Around noon, Marcus stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook that showed the vast expanse of desert stretching toward distant mountains. He ate a peanut butter sandwich and checked his GPS, pleased to see that he was making good time and staying exactly on his planned route. The technology felt reassuring in this alien landscape, a digital umbilical cord connecting him to the civilized world he understood. But as he prepared to continue hiking, Marcus noticed something troubling. His GPS was showing low battery despite being fully charged that morning. He brought a portable charger, but when he tried to use it, nothing happened. The device had somehow malfunctioned. For a moment, panic fluttered in his chest like a trapped bird. Then he reminded himself that he had paper maps as backup, and the main trail was well marked. He could handle this setback. The afternoon grew hotter as Marcus pushed deeper into the wilderness. The trail began to climb more steeply, winding through narrow canyons and over rocky ridges. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and he found himself drinking water more frequently than he'd planned. The desert was proving more challenging than his research had suggested. Every surface radiated heat, and the sun seemed to press down on him with physical weight. Around 3 o'clock, Marcus reached a junction where his trail intersected with several others. He stopped to consult his paper map, but the web of lines and contours seemed confusing without the GPS to show his exact location. He thought he remembered from his research that he should take the trail heading northeast, but 2 of the paths seemed to go in that general direction. After studying the map for 10 minutes, he chose what appeared to be the more traveled route, marked by occasional boot prints in the sandy patches between rocks. For the next 2 hours, Marcus followed this path as it led him deeper into a landscape of towering rock formations and narrow washes. The trail seemed less maintained than the earlier portions of his hike, but he assumed that was normal for wilderness areas. He was committed to his choice now, and turning back would mean admitting he'd made a mistake. Besides, according to his calculations, he should reach his planned camping spot within another hour or 2. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Marcus realized something was seriously wrong. The landscape around him looked nothing like what he'd seen in the photos he'd studied. The trail had become increasingly faint, sometimes disappearing entirely for stretches where he had to navigate by following what seemed like the most logical route through the maze of boulders and ravines. When full darkness fell, Marcus was forced to admit that he was lost. He set up his tent in a small clearing surrounded by massive rock formations that looked like ancient sentinels in the moonlight. His planned 3-day supply of water was already running lower than it should be after just 1 day of hiking. The desert night was surprisingly cold, and as he lay in his sleeping bag listening to the strange sounds of the wilderness, coyotes howling in the distance, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the settling sounds of cooling rock, Marcus felt truly alone for the first time in his life. He tried to use his cell phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The device showed full battery, but it might as well have been a paperweight in this remote location. As he lay there in the darkness, Marcus began to understand that his careful planning had been based on assumptions about a world he didn't really understand. The desert operated by different rules than the urban environment, where spreadsheets and schedules actually meant something. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds and the growing realization that he was in serious trouble. When Marcus woke the next morning, the first thing he noticed was how quickly his mouth had become dry during the night. The second thing he noticed was that his water bottles were nearly half empty, and he still had no idea where he was or how to get back to civilization. The sun rose like a molten coin, promising another day of punishing heat. Marcus packed his gear and set out, hoping to find either his original trail or some sign of human presence. But as the hours passed and the temperature climbed, he began to understand that the desert was not just indifferent to his presence, it was actively hostile to his survival. Every wrong turn led to more confusing terrain. Every attempt to retrace his steps seemed to lead to places he'd never seen before. By midday, with the sun directly overhead and no shade to be found, Marcus began to feel the first real grip of fear. His careful plans, his expensive gear, his detailed research, none of it mattered now. He was a small, vulnerable creature in a vast wilderness that had been claiming the lives of unprepared travelers for thousands of years. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a terrible truth was beginning to emerge. He might not make it home at all. The second day in the desert began with Marcus discovering that his remaining water had somehow become warm enough to brew coffee, despite being stored in an insulated bottle. The morning air was already thick with heat that seemed to rise from the rocks themselves, as if the earth was exhaling the previous day's accumulated fire. Marcus had slept poorly, waking every few hours to strange sounds, the distant yip of coyotes, the scratch of small animals across rocks, and once, what sounded like footsteps circling his tent. Marcus tried to maintain his methodical approach to problem-solving, the same systematic thinking that had made him successful in software development. He spread his paper map on a flat rock and attempted to triangulate his position using visible landmarks, but the desert played tricks on perception. What looked like a distinctive rock formation from one angle became invisible from another. Distances were impossible to judge. A mountain that appeared to be an hour's walk away could actually be a full day's journey. After 2 hours of hiking in what he believed was the direction of the main trail, Marcus found himself in a narrow canyon where the walls rose so high that the sun only reached the bottom for a few hours each day. The rock surfaces were smooth and polished, carved by flash floods that could turn this peaceful corridor into a raging torrent in minutes. Ancient petroglyphs decorated some of the walls, spirals, human figures, and animal shapes that had been carved there by people who actually understood how to survive in this harsh landscape. Marcus paused to photograph the rock art with his phone, partly from genuine interest and partly because it felt important to document his journey, as if creating evidence of his passage might somehow help him find his way home. As he studied the primitive drawings, he wondered about the people who had created them. They had lived here successfully for thousands of years without GPS devices or detailed topographic maps. They had possessed knowledge that he lacked, skills that no amount of internet research could provide. The canyon eventually opened into a broader valley, filled with mesquite trees and creosote bushes. The landscape here felt different, more alive somehow, and Marcus's spirits lifted slightly. He could hear the faint sound of running water, which seemed impossible in this arid environment. Following the sound, he discovered a small spring emerging from between two boulders, creating a tiny oasis surrounded by green vegetation. Marcus knelt and filled his water bottles, using the purification tablets he'd brought. The water was cool and clear, a gift from deep underground that tasted better than anything he'd ever drunk. He sat in the meager shade of a mesquite tree and ate an energy bar, trying to calculate how long his food would last if he couldn't find his way back to the trailhead soon. The numbers weren't encouraging. While resting at the spring, Marcus heard the sound of an engine in the distance. Hope surged through him like electricity. He scrambled up onto a nearby ridge, scanning the horizon for any sign of a vehicle. There, a small dust cloud moving slowly across the desert floor several miles away. Marcus pulled out his phone and tried to activate the flashlight to signal, but the battery was already running low from his attempts to get a signal. Instead, he gathered dry brush and used his pocket lighter to start a signal fire, feeding it with dried grass and small branches until it produced a column of smoke that rose straight up in the still air. But the distant vehicle disappeared behind a ridge, and Marcus never saw it again. The fire burned down to embers as he watched, leaving him feeling more isolated than before. By early afternoon, the temperature had climbed past what Marcus's weather app had predicted for the day. The sun seemed to press down on everything with malevolent intensity, creating heat mirages that made distant objects shimmer and dance. Marcus had been hiking for hours without seeing anything that matched his map, and his water supply was diminishing faster than he'd calculated. The desert was extracting moisture from his body through every pore, and no amount of drinking seemed to satisfy his thirst. Marcus began to make the kind of mistakes that could prove fatal in wilderness situations. Frustrated by his slow progress, he started taking shortcuts across open areas instead of following what remained of the faint trail. He convinced himself that he could navigate by heading toward a distant mountain peak. But in the confused terrain of canyons and mesas, he kept losing sight of his landmark. As the day wore on, Marcus's decision-making became increasingly impaired. Dehydration was affecting his judgment, making him irritable and prone to taking unnecessary risks. When he encountered a steep ravine that blocked his path, instead of carefully working his way around it, he attempted to climb down the near-vertical wall. Halfway down, his foot slipped on loose rock, and he tumbled the remaining distance, landing hard on his shoulder and scraping his leg from knee to ankle on the rough stone. Marcus lay at the bottom of the ravine for several minutes, checking for serious injuries. His shoulder throbbed and his leg burned where the skin had been scraped away, but nothing seemed broken. He used water from his precious supply to clean the wound and applied antibiotic cream from his first aid kit, but the incident left him shaken. He was beginning to understand how quickly things could go from bad to catastrophic in the wilderness. The ravine he'd fallen into was deeper and more complex than it had appeared from above. What had looked like a simple gully was actually a network of interconnected canyons that seemed to extend for miles in every direction. The walls were too steep to climb, and Marcus was forced to follow the sandy bottom, hoping it would eventually lead to an exit. But as he walked, the passages branched and subdivided like a three-dimensional maze, each choice potentially leading him further from safety. By late afternoon, Marcus was seriously concerned about his water situation. He had less than a quarter of his original supply remaining, and the physical effort of hiking in the heat was consuming it faster than he'd anticipated. His urine had turned dark yellow, a clear sign of dehydration that his research had warned him about. He began to ration his water more strictly, allowing himself only small sips at longer intervals. But this made the hiking even more miserable. The canyon walls were painted in layers of red, orange, and yellow stone that told the geological history of the region in bands of sediment laid down over millions of years. Under different circumstances, Marcus might have found the formations beautiful and fascinating. But now they just seemed like the walls of a prison that was slowly becoming his tomb. Every turn revealed more of the same twisting passages, and he began to suspect that he was walking in circles. As evening approached, Marcus faced a crucial decision. He could continue trying to find his way out of the canyon system in the fading light, or he could find a place to camp and hope that a night's rest would improve his situation. The thought of spending another night in the wilderness was terrifying, but trying to navigate in darkness seemed even more dangerous. He'd already made too many mistakes driven by impatience and poor judgment. Marcus found a relatively sheltered spot where two canyon walls met, offering some protection from wind and a flat area large enough for his tent. As he set up camp, he noticed that his hands were shaking slightly, whether from fatigue, dehydration, or fear, he couldn't tell. The simple task of inserting tent stakes into the sandy ground seemed to require enormous effort. That evening, as Marcus sat outside his tent eating a granola bar and trying to make his water last, he was forced to confront some harsh realities. His careful planning had failed him completely. His expensive gear was useful, but only if he could find his way back to civilization. His 3-day hiking trip had already extended beyond his planned return date, which meant that people would eventually notice he was missing. But how long would it take for anyone to find him in this vast wilderness? For the first time since getting lost, Marcus allowed himself to consider the possibility that he might die in this desert. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead it brought a strange kind of clarity. All the problems that had seemed so important in his regular life, his failed relationship, his stressful job, his need to control every detail of his existence, seemed trivial now. The only thing that mattered was finding water and getting home alive. As darkness fell and the temperature began to drop, Marcus heard new sounds echoing through the canyon. Something large was moving across the rocks above him, dislodging stones that clattered down the walls. He turned off his flashlight and listened intently, trying to determine whether the sounds were made by animals or something else. The footsteps seemed too heavy and deliberate to belong to deer or javelinas, but the idea that other people might be in this remote area seemed almost impossible. Marcus spent a restless night dozing fitfully and waking frequently to strange sounds that might have been wind, animals, or his imagination. When morning came, he discovered that condensation had collected on the outside of his tent, precious moisture that he carefully gathered with his bandana and squeezed into his water bottle. It wasn't much, but in his current situation, every drop counted. The third day began with Marcus facing a critical decision point. His water would last perhaps another day if he was very careful, and his food supply was also running dangerously low. He could continue wandering through the canyon maze hoping to find an exit, or he could try to climb out of the ravine system and take his chances in the open desert. Both options seemed to offer more possibilities for disaster than rescue, but staying put and waiting for help seemed even more hopeless. Marcus chose to climb. He found a section of canyon wall that looked less vertical than the others and began the dangerous ascent, using cracks in the rock and small ledges for handholds. The climb was exhausting and terrifying, with loose stones constantly threatening to give way under his weight. Several times he nearly fell, catching himself at the last moment and clinging to the rock face while his heart hammered against his ribs. When he finally pulled himself over the rim of the canyon, Marcus collapsed on solid ground, gasping and trembling from the effort. But his relief was short-lived. Stretching out before him was an endless expanse of desert that looked exactly like what he'd been walking through for the past 2 days. The sun was already high and hot, promising another day of punishing heat, and Marcus realized that his situation had not improved at all. If anything, he was now completely exposed with no shelter and no clear direction to travel. As Marcus stood on the edge of the canyon, surveying the hostile landscape that surrounded him, he began to understand that he was facing something much more serious than an inconvenient detour from his planned hiking route. He was engaged in a fundamental struggle for survival, and despite all his preparation and modern equipment, the desert was winning. The third morning in the desert brought Marcus face to face with a reality he'd been trying to avoid. He was dying. His lips had cracked so badly they bled when he tried to speak, and his tongue felt like sandpaper in his mouth. The last of his water was gone, consumed in desperate gulps during the previous day's futile attempt to find his way back to the main trail. His urine had stopped flowing entirely, a sign that his kidneys were beginning to shut down from dehydration. Marcus had always been logical, analytical, someone who believed that every problem had a solution if you applied enough intelligence and effort. But the desert operated according to different laws, older, more primal rules that didn't care about his engineering degree or his methodical approach to life. Out here, survival came down to knowledge he didn't possess and instincts he'd never developed. The morning sun was already brutal by 7 o'clock, and Marcus knew that walking during the day would only accelerate his dehydration. He'd read enough about desert survival to understand that he should rest during the heat and travel at night, but the landscape was too treacherous to navigate safely in darkness. Every option seemed to lead to the same inevitable conclusion. Marcus tried to find shelter under a large boulder, but even in the shade, the air temperature was climbing rapidly. The rock itself radiated heat like a giant oven, and there was no escape from the oppressive warmth that seemed to press against him from every direction. He closed his eyes and tried to conserve energy, but his mind raced with thoughts of everything he'd never done, places he'd never seen, words he'd never said to the people who mattered to him. Around midday, Marcus began to hallucinate. At first, it was just movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that turned out to be tricks of the light when he turned to look directly. But as the hours passed and his condition deteriorated, the hallucinations became more vivid and persistent. He saw Sarah standing in the distance, calling to him with her arms outstretched. He saw his childhood dog, Buster, running across the desert sand with his tongue hanging out. Most disturbing of all, he began to see water everywhere, sparkling lakes and running streams that vanished when he tried to approach them. The rational part of Marcus's mind understood that these visions were symptoms of severe dehydration, but they felt absolutely real in the moment. He found himself standing up and walking toward these mirages, stumbling across rough terrain in pursuit of salvation that existed only in his oxygen-starved brain. Each time reality reasserted itself, leaving him more lost and exhausted than before. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Marcus made what he knew might be his final attempt to find help. He climbed to the top of a high ridge, using the last of his strength to scramble up the steep slope. From this vantage point, he could see for miles in every direction. But the view only confirmed his worst fears. There was nothing but endless desert stretching to the horizon. No roads, no buildings, no signs of human presence anywhere. Marcus pulled out his phone, knowing it was hopeless but unable to stop himself from trying one more time. No signal, and the battery was down to 15%. In a moment of desperate inspiration, he opened the camera app and recorded a video message for his family and friends, explaining what had happened and apologizing for all the things he'd done wrong. His voice was barely a whisper, but he managed to tell his parents he loved them and to ask Sarah to forgive him for being so rigid and controlling. After recording the message, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace. He'd done everything he could think of to survive, and now there was nothing left but to accept whatever came next. He made his way back down the ridge and found a shaded spot between two large rocks where he could rest. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors that seemed almost too beautiful for a place where he was about to die. As Marcus sat waiting for the end, he noticed something that made his heart skip. In the sand near his feet were tracks. Not animal tracks, but the clear impression of a boot print. The track was fresh, maybe only a few hours old, and it was heading in a definite direction, as if the person who made it knew exactly where they were going. With renewed hope surging through his exhausted body, Marcus began to follow the tracks. They led through a maze of boulders and across patches of open sand, always maintaining a steady direction toward the northeast. Whoever had made these prints was moving with purpose and confidence, covering ground much faster than Marcus could manage in his weakened condition. As Marcus struggled to follow the trail, he began to notice other signs of human passage. Broken twigs on mesquite bushes, stones displaced from their natural positions, faint scuff marks on rock surfaces. Someone had definitely passed this way recently, and they seemed to know the terrain well. The tracks were large, much larger than Marcus's own feet, suggesting that he was following a person of considerable size and weight. The sun was setting by the time Marcus crested a low hill and saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Below him, perhaps a quarter-mile away, was a small camp. Smoke rose from a carefully built fire, and Marcus could see two figures moving around the campsite. They were too far away for him to make out details, but they appeared to be very large men, both of them well over 6 feet tall and powerfully built. Marcus tried to call out, but his damaged throat could produce only a weak croak. He began stumbling down the hillside toward the camp, waving his arms and trying to attract attention. But his legs were unsteady, and halfway down the slope, he tripped over a loose stone and tumbled head over heels, coming to rest in a painful heap at the bottom of the hill. When Marcus looked up, he found himself staring at a pair of enormous boots. His gaze traveled upward, taking in legs like tree trunks, a massive torso, and finally, a face that seemed carved from the same red rock as the surrounding landscape. The man standing over him had to be at least 6.5 feet tall, with long black hair tied back in a ponytail and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His clothes were practical outdoor gear, but worn and weathered in a way that suggested years of use. Behind the first man, a second figure approached, even larger than the first, if that was possible. This one had graying hair and a weathered face marked by decades of sun and wind. Both men carried themselves with the easy confidence of people who belonged in this harsh environment, who understood its rhythms and respected its power. Marcus tried to speak, to explain his situation and ask for help, but his voice failed completely. The larger of the two men knelt beside him, his movements surprisingly gentle for someone so massive. He placed a calloused hand on Marcus's forehead, checking for fever, then examined his cracked lips and dry eyes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with dehydration before. Without speaking, the man lifted Marcus as easily as if he were a child and carried him toward their camp. Marcus was too weak to protest or even feel embarrassed by his helplessness. All that mattered was that he was no longer alone, that these strangers had found him before it was too late. At the campsite, the two men worked with quiet efficiency to care for their unexpected patient. They gave Marcus small sips of water from a military-style canteen, not allowing him to drink too much too quickly despite his desperate thirst. They cleaned his wounds with antiseptic and applied fresh bandages, their large hands surprisingly gentle and skilled. As Marcus began to recover slightly from his immediate crisis, he tried to thank his rescuers and learn who they were. The younger of the two men introduced himself as Joe Yazzie, and his companion as his uncle, Thomas Yazzie. They were members of the White Mountain Apache tribe, Joe explained, and they had been tracking Marcus for almost a day after finding his original campsite and realizing that an inexperienced hiker was lost in their traditional hunting grounds. Marcus learned that the Yazzie men were part of a tribal search and rescue team that helped lost hikers and hunters in the wilderness areas around their reservation. They possessed intimate knowledge of the land that had been passed down through generations, combined with modern rescue techniques and equipment. What had seemed like an impossible maze of canyons and ridges to Marcus was as familiar to them as the streets of their hometown. Joe explained that they had found Marcus's abandoned tent and the evidence of his increasingly desperate attempts to navigate the difficult terrain. They had been following his trail, reading the story of his mistakes, and growing panic in the scuff marks and disturbed vegetation he'd left behind. To them, his path through the wilderness was as clear and readable as a book. As the evening progressed and Marcus slowly rehydrated, the two Apache men shared their food and water without question or expectation of payment. They told him stories of other lost hikers they had rescued, some in even worse condition than he was. They spoke of the desert with respect and affection, describing it not as a hostile wasteland, but as a challenging yet life-sustaining home for those who understood its ways. Thomas, the elder, explained that their people had been surviving in this landscape for thousands of years, developing skills and knowledge that allowed them to thrive where others perished. He spoke of reading weather patterns in cloud formations, of finding water in places that looked completely barren, of navigating by stars and landmarks invisible to untrained eyes. As Marcus listened to their stories, he began to understand how completely unprepared he had been for this journey. His expensive gear and careful research had been like bringing a calculator to solve a problem that required wisdom instead of computation. The desert demanded respect, humility, and knowledge that couldn't be downloaded from the internet or purchased at an outdoor store. That night, as Marcus lay in his sleeping bag by the Apache men's fire, he felt safer than he had since getting lost. The flames pushed back the darkness, and the quiet conversation of his rescuers provided a comforting human presence in the vast wilderness. For the first time in days, he was able to sleep deeply, knowing that he was in the hands of people who understood this harsh land and how to survive in it. But Marcus's ordeal was not over. Getting him back to civilization would require another day of difficult travel through terrain that remained treacherous despite his newfound companions. And the experience of coming so close to death would leave marks on his soul that would take much longer to heal than his physical wounds. Marcus woke the next morning to the sound of Thomas Yazzie quietly tending the fire, adding small pieces of dry wood to maintain a steady flame for cooking breakfast. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, and the air was still cool from the desert night. For a moment, Marcus forgot where he was and how he'd gotten there. Then the events of the previous days came flooding back, along with the realization that he was alive only because two strangers had chosen to save him. Joe Yazzie was already up and moving around the campsite, his massive frame moving with surprising grace as he checked their gear and prepared for the day's journey. Both men seemed to require very little sleep, rising before dawn as if their internal clocks were perfectly synchronized with the natural rhythms of the desert. Marcus, despite sleeping more soundly than he had in days, felt weak and disoriented as he struggled to sit up. Thomas handed him a metal cup filled with strong coffee and a simple breakfast of beans and flatbread cooked over the open fire. The food was plain but satisfying, and Marcus realized he hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. His expensive energy bars and freeze-dried camping food seemed pathetic compared to this simple, nourishing breakfast prepared by men who understood how to live off the land. As they ate, Joe explained their plan for getting Marcus back to safety. The direct route to the Peralta trailhead, where his car was parked, would take them through some of the most difficult terrain in the wilderness area. Steep climbs, narrow passages, and areas where one wrong step could result in a dangerous fall. But Joe and Thomas knew alternative routes that would be longer but safer for someone in Marcus's weakened condition. Marcus tried to insist that he felt strong enough to take the direct route, not wanting to inconvenience his rescuers any more than he already had. But Thomas gave him a look that was both kind and firm, the expression of someone who had seen too many people overestimate their abilities in the wilderness. He explained that pride and impatience had contributed to Marcus's original predicament, and that learning to accept help gracefully was part of becoming wise about the desert. The Apache men broke camp with efficient movements that spoke of years of practice. They packed their gear into two large backpacks that seemed to contain everything they might need for extended wilderness travel. Marcus noticed that their equipment was mostly simple, practical items rather than the high-tech gear he had brought. Their sleeping bags were older military surplus, their cooking equipment was basic metal pots and pans, but everything was well maintained and perfectly suited to its purpose. Before they set out, Thomas performed a brief ritual that Marcus didn't fully understand but found deeply moving. The older man faced each of the four directions, speaking quietly in Apache while holding a small bundle of sage. He explained later that he was acknowledging the spirits of the land and asking for safe passage for all three travelers. It was a practice his grandfather had taught him, connecting him to generations of Apache people who had moved through this landscape. As they began walking, Marcus immediately understood why the Yazzie men had suggested the longer route. Even the easy path they followed required scrambling over boulder fields, navigating narrow ledges, and crossing sandy washes where the footing was uncertain. In his current condition, Marcus could never have managed the more direct route safely. Every few hundred yards, Joe or Thomas would pause to check on him, offering water or suggesting rest breaks without making him feel like a burden. The two Apache men moved through the terrain with an ease that seemed almost supernatural to Marcus. They seemed to know exactly where to place each foot, which rocks would be stable, and which might shift dangerously under their weight. They pointed out landmarks that were invisible to Marcus's untrained eye. Subtle changes in vegetation that indicated underground water, rock formations that served as navigation markers, animal tracks that told stories about the creatures that shared this harsh environment. As they walked, Thomas began teaching Marcus some basics of desert survival, not in a formal instructional way, but through casual conversation and observation. He showed Marcus how to recognize plants that could provide emergency water, how to read the landscape to predict weather changes, how to move efficiently across different types of terrain. It was knowledge that had been refined over thousands of years, passed down from generation to generation through direct experience rather than books or websites. Joe told Marcus about their work with the tribal search and rescue team, explaining that they responded to calls for help throughout a vast area of wilderness that encompassed traditional Apache lands and several state and federal recreation areas. They worked closely with county sheriff's departments and federal agencies, but their knowledge of the land often made them the most effective first responders for wilderness emergencies. Marcus learned that the Yazzie men had both served in the military, before returning to the reservation to work in various capacities that kept them connected to their traditional lands. Joe had been an Army Ranger who served multiple deployments in Afghanistan, while Thomas was a Vietnam veteran who had spent 30 years working for the Tribal Forestry Department. Their combination of traditional knowledge and modern training made them uniquely qualified for wilderness rescue work. As the morning progressed, Marcus began to appreciate the subtle complexity of navigating in the desert. What had seemed like a random jumble of rocks and vegetation to his inexperienced eye was actually a landscape rich with information for those who knew how to read it. The Apache men pointed out signs that indicated underground water, showed him how the shape of erosion patterns revealed the direction of seasonal water flow, taught him to recognize the difference between game trails and paths created by human travel. Around midday, they reached a section of the route that required careful route finding through a maze of tall rock formations. The passages between the stone pillars were narrow and winding, creating a three-dimensional puzzle that could easily confuse even experienced hikers. But Joe and Thomas navigated through the maze with confidence, following routes that seemed to be marked only in their memories. Marcus realized that this was the area where he had become completely lost several days earlier. Viewed from the correct perspective, with knowledgeable guides, the maze revealed an underlying logic that had been invisible to him before. The Apache men explained that this formation had been used as a natural fortress by their ancestors, and that knowledge of the correct passages had been closely guarded tribal information for generations. As they emerged from the rock maze onto a high plateau, Marcus was startled to see evidence of ancient human presence everywhere. Grinding holes in flat rock surfaces where generations of Apache women had processed seeds and nuts, pictographs on sheltered rock faces depicting hunting scenes and ceremonial activities, stone circles marking the locations of temporary camps used by hunting parties over hundreds of years. Thomas explained that this entire area was sacred to the Apache people, not in the sense of being a formal religious site, but because it was intimately connected to their cultural survival and identity. Every water source, every shelter, every game trail held significance as part of a vast knowledge system that had allowed his people to thrive in an environment that challenged even modern technology. Marcus began to understand that his near-death experience in the desert was connected to a much larger story about the relationship between humans and the natural world. His careful planning and expensive equipment had failed him because they were based on assumptions about control and predictability that didn't apply in the wilderness. The Apache approach to the desert was based on respect, adaptation, and accumulated wisdom rather than the illusion of technological dominance. As afternoon approached, they began a long descent toward the area where Marcus had originally entered the wilderness. The landscape gradually became more familiar, and Marcus began to recognize landmarks from his first day of hiking. But everything looked different now, viewed through the lens of his ordeal and his growing appreciation for the complexity of the desert environment. The Yazzie men pointed out the spot where Marcus had first left the main trail, explaining how they had read the evidence of his confusion and growing desperation in the disturbed vegetation and scattered gear he had left behind. They showed him the correct route he should have taken, a path that was clearly marked for those who knew what to look for but had been invisible to his inexperienced eye. By late afternoon, Marcus could see the distant parking area where his rental car waited. The sight filled him with mixed emotions. Relief at the prospect of returning to the familiar world of paved roads and cellular signals, but also a strange sadness at leaving behind the profound experience of the wilderness. He had entered the desert as one person and was leaving as someone fundamentally changed by his encounter with mortality and his rescue by strangers who had become something more than friends. As they reached the final descent toward the trailhead, Marcus tried to find words to express his gratitude to Joe and Thomas Yazzie. But anything he could say seemed inadequate to acknowledge the fact that these men had saved his life and asked for nothing in return. They had interrupted their own plans, used their own resources, and shared their knowledge freely with someone who had started as a complete stranger. Joe smiled at Marcus's attempts to thank them, explaining that helping lost travelers was simply part of their responsibility as people who understood the desert and possessed the skills to move safely through it. In Apache culture, he said, knowledge and ability came with obligations to use those gifts for the benefit of others. They had been helped by others throughout their lives, and helping Marcus was a way of maintaining the balance that kept their community strong. As they approached the parking area, Marcus could see his rental car exactly where he had left it several days earlier. The vehicle looked strange and out of place in the natural landscape, like an artifact from an alien civilization. Inside that car were his old clothes, his laptop, his cell phone charger, all the tools and accessories of his former life that now seemed both precious and somehow less important than they had been before his ordeal. Thomas handed Marcus a small piece of polished stone that he said was from a place sacred to the Apache people. It was not a souvenir or tourist trinket, but a genuine gift that carried meaning and responsibility. Thomas explained that the stone would help Marcus remember not just his rescue, but the lessons about humility and respect that the desert had taught him. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors Marcus had seen during his darkest moments alone in the wilderness, he understood that his journey was ending in a way he could never have planned or predicted. He had set out seeking adventure and spontaneity, hoping to prove something to himself, and perhaps to Sarah. Instead, he had discovered that the most profound adventures were those that stripped away illusions and revealed fundamental truths about survival, community, and the connections between human beings that transcended culture and circumstance. The desert had nearly killed him, but it had also given him something invaluable: an understanding of his own limitations and an appreciation for the knowledge and generosity of others. As he prepared to return to his regular life, Marcus knew that he would carry the memory of the Yazzie brothers and their gift of rescue with him forever. 6 months after his rescue from the superstition wilderness, Marcus Chen stood in his Seattle apartment, packing a much smaller, more practical backpack for another trip to Arizona. But this time, he wasn't going alone, and he wasn't going unprepared. The expensive gear that had failed him during his first desert experience had been replaced with simpler, more reliable equipment chosen with advice from Joe and Thomas Yazzie, who had become unlikely mentors and friends in the months since his rescue. The transformation in Marcus's life had been gradual but profound. Returning to Seattle after his ordeal, he had initially tried to slip back into his old routines: the demanding work schedule, the obsessive planning, the need to control every variable in his environment. But something fundamental had changed during those terrifying days in the desert, and his previous life no longer fit as comfortably as it once had. His co-workers noticed the change immediately. The man who had once scheduled his lunch breaks and color-coded his calendar now seemed more relaxed, more willing to accept uncertainty and adapt to changing circumstances. Marcus found that his near-death experience had given him a different perspective on the problems that had once seemed so urgent. Software bugs and project deadlines still mattered, but they no longer felt like life-or-death emergencies. More surprisingly, Marcus's relationship with Sarah had begun to heal. When he returned from Arizona, he had called her to share what had happened, not to rekindle their romance, but to acknowledge the truth in her criticisms of his rigid approach to life. The conversation had been difficult but honest, with Marcus admitting that his need to control everything had indeed made their relationship feel suffocating and predictable. Sarah had been shocked by his story of survival and rescue, and they had met for coffee to talk more about his experience and what it meant for both of them. She could see the change in him, a new humility and openness that had been missing during their 3 years together. While they didn't immediately get back together, they began spending time as friends, exploring the possibility of a different kind of relationship based on the person Marcus was becoming, rather than who he had been. The most significant change in Marcus's life, however, was his growing connection to Joe and Thomas Yazzie. What had begun as a simple expression of gratitude had evolved into a deeper friendship that bridged the gap between their very different worlds. Marcus had started making regular trips to the White Mountain Apache Reservation, not as a tourist seeking authentic experiences, but as someone genuinely interested in learning from people whose knowledge and wisdom had saved his life. Joe had become something like an older brother to Marcus, teaching him practical wilderness skills, while sharing stories about Apache culture and history. Thomas, despite the significant age difference, had taken Marcus under his wing as well, patiently answering questions about traditional ecological knowledge and the spiritual dimensions of living in harmony with the natural world. Both men seemed to understand that Marcus's questions came from a sincere desire to understand rather than casual curiosity. Through his friendship with the Yazzie family, Marcus had discovered a whole community of people whose relationship with the natural world was fundamentally different from anything he had experienced growing up in suburban environments and urban workplaces. He learned about traditional hunting and gathering practices, about the complex protocols for harvesting plants and medicines, about the intergenerational transmission of knowledge that allowed communities to thrive in challenging environments. Marcus had also become involved with the tribal search and rescue team, not as an official member, but as someone willing to help with logistics and fundraising for their operations. He used his technical skills to help them upgrade their communication equipment and GPS systems, while learning from their expertise about reading terrain and predicting human behavior in wilderness emergencies. It was a collaboration that benefited both sides and deepened Marcus's understanding of what it meant to be part of a community that took care of its own. The trip he was preparing for now was different from his original solo adventure in several important ways. First, he would be traveling with Joe and Thomas as part of a traditional hunting party, learning skills that had been practiced by Apache people for generations. Second, his gear was chosen for functionality rather than impressive specifications, based on equipment that had been tested by people who depended on it for survival rather than recreation. Most importantly, Marcus's attitude toward the wilderness had been transformed. Instead of viewing the desert as a challenge to be conquered or an experience to be consumed, he now understood it as a complex living system that demanded respect, patience, and humility. His goal was not to prove anything about himself, but to continue learning from people who understood the subtle relationships between humans and the natural world. As Marcus finished packing his gear, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that terrifying morning when he woke up lost and alone in the desert. The experience of facing death had stripped away many of his illusions about control and self-sufficiency, but it had also opened him up to connections and experiences that were richer and more meaningful than anything he had known before. His relationship with Sarah had evolved into something deeper than their original romance. They had remarried 6 months ago, but their new partnership was based on mutual respect for each other's autonomy and a shared commitment to growth and adventure. Sarah had even accompanied Marcus on several trips to Arizona, developing her own friendships within the Apache community and finding inspiration for her art in the dramatic landscapes of the Southwest. Marcus's work life had also been transformed. He had negotiated a more flexible schedule that allowed him to spend significant time in Arizona, and he had begun using his technical skills to support tribal education and environmental monitoring programs. His company had eventually hired him as a consultant rather than a full-time employee, giving him the freedom to pursue projects that felt meaningful rather than just profitable. But perhaps the most profound change in Marcus's life was his understanding of what it meant to be rescued and what obligations that created. Joe and Thomas had saved his life not because they expected anything in return, but because their culture taught them that people with knowledge and skills had responsibilities to use those gifts for the benefit of others. Marcus had taken that lesson to heart, looking for ways to pass along what he had learned and to support others who found themselves lost or struggling. He had started volunteering with search and rescue organizations in Washington, using his experience of being lost to help train other volunteers in how to think about the psychology of people in wilderness emergencies. He had spoken at hiking clubs and outdoor recreation groups about the importance of proper preparation and the dangers of overconfidence in unfamiliar environments. Most importantly, he had learned to recognize when his own skills and knowledge could help others and to offer that help freely. As Marcus locked his apartment and headed for the airport, he carried with him the small piece of polished stone that Thomas had given him after his rescue. The stone had become a touchstone for the lessons he had learned in the desert, about humility, about community, about the difference between surviving and truly living. It reminded him that his life had been given back to him, not just by the skill and generosity of 2 Apache men, but by his willingness to accept help and to learn from people whose knowledge was different from his own. The flight to Phoenix gave Marcus time to think about how his story had become part of a larger narrative about the relationships between different communities and ways of knowing. His rescue had not been a simple matter of one group helping another, but an example of how traditional knowledge and modern technology could complement each other when people approached each other with respect and openness. Marcus had learned that the Apache people who had saved his life were not living in the past but were actively engaged in preserving and adapting their traditional knowledge for contemporary challenges. Their search and rescue work was just one example of how indigenous communities were using their understanding of local environments to address problems that affected everyone who used wilderness areas. When Marcus arrived at the reservation, he was greeted by Joe and Thomas's family, rather than as a visitor. The hunting trip they were embarking on would last 2 weeks and would take them deep into traditional Apache hunting grounds that were closed to outsiders. It was an honor that Marcus understood came with significant responsibilities, to learn respectfully, to contribute what he could to the success of the group, and to carry forward the knowledge he gained in ways that would benefit others. As they set out into the desert that had once nearly claimed his life, Marcus felt no fear, only anticipation and gratitude. He had learned that the wilderness was neither a playground for adventure seekers nor a hostile wasteland to be conquered, but a complex living system that could sustain and teach those who approached it with proper preparation and respect. His relationship with the desert, like his relationships with Joe and Thomas and even with Sarah, was now based on mutual respect and ongoing commitment rather than the desire to extract something for his own benefit. The sun was setting as their small group made their first camp in familiar territory, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that Marcus had first seen during his darkest hour. But now those colors spoke to him not of endings but of continuity, the daily rhythm of a landscape that had sustained human communities for thousands of years and would continue to do so for generations to come. Marcus had entered the desert as a lost and desperate stranger, but he was returning as someone who belonged to a community that extended far beyond the boundaries of his previous life. As he helped prepare the evening meal over an open fire, Marcus understood that his rescue from the superstition wilderness had been more than a simple matter of being found when he was lost. It had been the beginning of a new life based on relationships and knowledge that connected him to something much larger than his individual survival. The desert had nearly killed him, but it had also given him a gift more valuable than his life, the understanding that true security came not from control or technology, but from being part of a community that took care of its members and shared its knowledge freely with those willing to learn.